Look out, because today we're going to be talking about DR Horton, and it will not all be pretty. Well, hey there, this is Wendy Pinnell, and we're going to see as we talk about DR Horton today that they are very much geared towards first-time home buyers. We're going to see a more affordable home, which means we're going to see some not so high-end products being used. But first, a little bit about the company itself. All right. Here's how they introduce themselves and what they have to say about their history. DR Horton, Inc., America's builder, has been the largest home builder by volume in the United States since 2002 and has closed more than 1 million homes in its 45-year history. They continue saying, DR Horton has operations in 118 markets in 33 states across the United States. So we're talking a pretty large company. So what is their price range like? Well, they will be your affordable builder. Okay, you've got places like Wildcat Ranch in Crandall, where you can score a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage in the 240s. And Wildcat Ranch has some nice things to offer. Okay, it has a clubhouse, fitness center, pool, playground. Crandall is about a 30 to 35 minute drive to Dallas on the southwest side, so that's really not an atrocious commute either. Now on their higher end, you'll find homes priced up into like the low 500s. For example, DR Horton has homes in Sutton Fields and Salina, ranging in price from like $480 to like the $498, approximately that price range. You can score like a 4-bedroom, 2-bath with over 1,900 square foot there, okay? And in Sutton Fields, here's the thing about Sutton Fields, okay? It's in the Prosper ISD, which is like one of our top school districts here in the Dallas area. Plus Sutton Fields has a little bit of in the way of amenities, okay? It has a pool and some nice ponds. Being so affordable, DR Horton is definitely a production builder, okay? Now this is not one where you'll do, a custom new build with all the bells and whistles. In fact, I'd say it's pretty rare to have like any custom builds at all. DR Horton's communities are almost entirely like cookie cutter, large production build neighborhoods. All right, so where in the DFW area will you find them? Well, the bigger question, okay, is where will you not find them? On their website, I counted 75 cities, but they build the least on the north side of DFW. All right, and that makes sense because, DR Horton is more affordable, and our north side of Dallas, right, which is Collin County, right, that is the most expensive area in the DFW Metroplex. All right, let's dig into the transaction side of DR Horton. What are their contracts like? Well, remember when I said DR Horton is affordable and really could be considered like a stepping stone for getting first-time buyers into home ownership? Well, we're gonna see that in the contract as well. I mean, it's fairly easy to read, and it gives a generous allowance for the buyer to get their financing, right? Because, with a first-time buyer, you might not have your credit all the way built up. I mean, it's a new process for many at that point. So let's dig into the contract. It's awesome that it's easy to read, but we're gonna find there's a lot to talk about that really puts the buyer at a disadvantage. All right, for example, take a look at their deposit policy. We always wanna ask, the same question we always ask, right? Under what circumstances can the deposit be returned to me? And for what reasons can you lose it? All right, well, this is what it says. Buyer understands and agrees that the deposit will be deposited into seller's general account, will not be segregated from other funds, and the deposit is non-refundable except as expressly provided herein. It continues. The additional money deposit and all other funds collected for upgrades or optional items for the property are non-refundable under any circumstances except for a proper termination for seller's default. Okay, so basically you're never going to get a refund on any additional money deposit or funds for upgrades unless DR Horton defaults, okay, according to this contract. Now let's take a look at their financing policy, okay? Here's what the contract says. Buyer will apply for a mortgage within 5 calendar days from the contract date. Buyer will use best efforts to obtain approval promptly upon applying for the loan. If at any time after 30 days from the contract date, buyer is unable to provide evidence of approval for the loan as determined in seller's sole discretion, seller will have the right to cancel this contract. If seller cancels the contract and determines that buyer used best efforts but was unable to obtain approval for the loan, seller will refund the deposit. So according to this verbiage, if you've been trying to get financing for 30 days and now it's even after 30 days, you still have the possibility of getting your deposit returned if you can't get a loan. DR Horton may decide to terminate the contract themselves if you can't and then return the deposit to you. So that is extremely generous from a timing standpoint. Okay, moving on, here is their policy on buyer interference. Buyer will not direct sellers' subcontractors to perform any work or communicate with sellers' subcontractors regarding any aspect of the work. If buyer violates this subsection 5A, seller's warranties will be void and seller will be entitled to cancel this contract and seek all available remedies. So pretty much when that home is under construction, okay, you cannot interfere in any way with the subcontractors. Like if you go into that house and they're doing it all wrong, the countertops are wrong, the cabinets are wrong, whatever, okay? You can't talk to them, okay? Because it's not your place. You have to let them continue doing it wrong and then take it up with the sales consultant or management. Next, here's what happens if you can't close on time. Paragraph 14 states, buyer will be in default under this contract if buyer advises seller in writing or otherwise that buyer will not fully perform buyer's obligations under this contract, or buyer fails to fully and timely perform any provision of this contract, including but not limited to timely paying deposits or timely completing the closing. If buyer defaults, seller may cancel this contract at any time by giving buyer written notice, and seller is entitled to retain the deposit. So not a lot of leniency here. If you can't close on time, you're in default. And DR Horton can decide to terminate the contract and keep your deposit. However, they can also decide not to terminate and to penalize you instead for late closing. This is what they say. If buyer does not close the purchase of the property on or before the closing date, buyer understands and agrees that seller shall have the right to terminate this contract as described in section 14 below. If seller does not elect to terminate the contract and the closing subsequently occurs after the initially set closing date, seller has the right to charge to buyer, and buyer shall pay to seller a late closing fee up to $75 per day. Now, believe it or not, I have to tell you, this is another example of where DR Horton is actually a little generous. Like if you can't close on time with K. Hovnanian, the contract allows them to charge $500 a day for every day late. Normandy Homes, they charge $250 a day. So yeah, $75 a day with DR Horton, okay? You definitely want to be aware of that and make sure you're ready to close on time, okay? But believe me when I tell you, it could be a lot worse. And the question of the hour is the convenience clause in the DR Horton contract. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about here, many builders will have a clause that allows them to cancel the contract for any reason or no reason at all. Like they can just cancel the contract and not even give you a reason. All right, so is the convenience clause in the DR Horton contract? Okay, well, this is what you'll find. The contract reads, notwithstanding any provision of the contract to the contrary, if a bona fide dispute arises between the parties prior to the closing that the parties cannot reasonably and promptly resolve through good faith negotiations, then seller can advise buyer in writing that if the matter is not resolved within 10 days, seller can elect to terminate the contract and return the deposit to buyer. If this remedy is pursued, neither party will have any other claims or causes of action against each other. So not exactly a convenience clause, but it does give the seller an easy out if they don't agree. However, according to DR Horton's terms here, you at least get your deposit back since the seller chose to terminate. Now, next question, do they include CC&Rs in their contracts or do you have to hunt for them? All right, you definitely have to hunt for them. All right, the contract does mention that you have an HOA, but that's about it. Okay, and remember, important distinction here. With a pre-owned home, the contract will allow time to carefully review covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And then, you could withdraw from the contract if you didn't like what you saw, but that's not the case here. You need to review those CC&Rs before you ever sign that contract. All right, let's talk about appraisal contingencies for a minute. When you buy a home, your lender will order an appraisal to decide how much the home is worth. Then they're gonna loan based on the lower of either the appraisal or the sales price. If the home appraises for less than the sales price, every new construction contract I've ever read says you, the buyer, will make up the difference. Now, DR Horton does too, all right? But they word it a little differently, all right? This is what they say. This contract is not contingent on an appraisal. Buyer shall be required to proceed to closing without regard to whether the property is appraised for less than the purchase price. This is an example again of how you're protected far more with a pre-owned contract, where you can structure your offer to protect you if an appraisal comes in short. Now, I want to tell you something else about the contract that's really important. All right, we had a situation recently where one of our buyers initially planned to buy with a loan, but they ultimately decided to pay cash, right? The builder now had offered money, like a concession, to pay our buyer's closing costs. Well, suddenly our buyer no longer needed that assistance, right? Because their closing costs just didn't cost that much because there wasn't a lender involved. Well, this particular builder graciously agreed to take that concession and lower the sales price instead, all right? But listen to how DR Horton handles a situation like this. The contract says, buyer understands that any unused seller contribution, allowance, and or credit towards closing costs will not, under any circumstances, be refunded to buyer, used as a credit, contribution, or allowance against the purchase price, or used to fund buyer's escrow account, if any, except as determined by seller in its sole discretion. Buyer further understands that all such unused seller contribution, allowance, and or credit will be forfeited. If you're working with DR Horton, you need to ensure anything they're offering as an incentive, such as closing costs, can genuinely be used up all the way, or that incentive just doesn't exist, okay? It just completely evaporates. All right, something else you need to know. DR Horton's going to share your contact information. All right, the contract states, we collect contact information such as your name, address, email address, and phone number. We use this personal information to permit third parties to communicate with you, including about products and services that may be of interest to you. So that's kind of a nice, little final touch there. Next up, let's talk about inspection restrictions. Many home builders have restrictions on having their homes inspected by a third party. So it's important that we talk about that. Now, with DR Horton, I didn't see any reference in their actual contract, but after some pretty deep research, I found the following document on the Home Inspection Forum. In it, Senior Superintendent Michael Abell states, in regards to pre-pour inspections, pre-sheetrock frame inspections, it is DR Horton's policy that we no longer allow these inspections. You will be allowed to do a third-party inspection at final. I found this document on a forum and it doesn't even have a date on it. So suffice it to say, you need to do your due diligence and ask questions about inspection policies prior to going under contract. All right, we've talked a lot about DR Horton thus far, but something we haven't touched on yet is their architectural style. So let's talk about that for a little bit. From an architectural standpoint, you're not gonna find anything elegant or distinctive. Like for example, Grand Homes, they have homes with spires and turrets, or Perry Homes, like they have a very specific line of homes that has a very modern look, right? You're not gonna find that distinctiveness with DR Horton. Most of the time, you're talking about a very basic ranch style home with a gently sloping gable roof. Usually it'll have a front-facing two-car garage on one side, then maybe like your front door in the middle, and then windows on the other side. You'll see some decorative stone finishes, but nothing like really exotic or outlandish. I would say most of the time you're gonna have a brick exterior, but sometimes it'll be siding. The homes are designed to be neutral and universally appealing, so lots of different versions of essentially the same thing. Okay, now let's touch on construction quality for a minute. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that DR Horton is definitely your affordable builder, but in that, you've gotta expect some tolerance towards lower quality materials. And you'll find this in your interior, your exterior, and everything in between. All right, so think about like everything from like your roof shingles to your plumbing fixtures, to all the things you can't see, your wiring, your pipes, okay? Of course, your flooring. Nothing here is gonna be bells and whistles, right? One really hot topic we've seen lately is that of sheathing. And basically, if you're not sure what that is, sheathing is what a home is wrapped in before brick is added, all right? Once the brick is added, you'll never know it's there, all right? So with sheathing, you have everything like from a sturdy wood board product to a very thin product called T-ply. that no one seems to really speak fondly of. And of course, with DR Horton, what do they use? Well, they use that thinner T-ply. So we've heard some good and some bad about DR Horton, but what are people actually saying after working with them? Well, we got to take it local first, right? Because remember, DR Horton is a huge company. So, if a community out in Chicago has horrible reviews, that doesn't mean the one in Little Elm is also bad. And here's something interesting about the local reviews that I want to tell you. At the different locations, they're actually pretty good, like mostly in the 4s to 5s. But what's interesting is that their corporate headquarters and division offices scored low. So that makes me wonder, like when you have a big problem and maybe you need to like accelerate it to the next level, then maybe, you don't get very far. I mean, that's purely speculation, but it does make you wonder. Here are some reviews on local communities. Millstone in McKinney scored a 4.5. Winchester Crossing in Princeton had a 4.3. Camden Park in Anna has a 4.2. Sutton Fields in Salina has a 4.6. The Elevon in Levon has a 4.6. So locally, these reviews are not bad at all. But let's look on a bigger level, all right? DR Horton on Yelp has 185 votes and gives DR Horton a 1.3. All right, how about the Better Business Bureau, right? BBB. The Better Business Bureau gives DR Horton an A+ with 1,320 complaints closed within the past 3 years and 418 complaints closed in the past 12 months. Now, remember how I said DR Horton is a starter home that's very much geared towards the first-time home buyer? Well, I want you to remember this tip. Are you ready for it? All right, here's the tip. If you can't buy greatness, buy near greatness. So in your home buying journey, if you're just starting out, all right, DR Horton may be exactly what you can afford. And that's fine. It fills the need of an affordable product. But this is what I want you to think about. DR Horton builds in tons of neighborhoods where they are the only builder, right? The entire neighborhood, just DR Horton homes. Like we're talking very little architectural diversity, very little price variance, okay? That's not your better choice here. Instead, if a DR Horton is what works for your budget right now, buying a neighborhood with expensive builders in it. All right, Pecan Square in Northlake comes to mind. Like you have DR Horton nestled in with the likes of Coventry and Highland and even Toll Brothers, right? So where do you think you're going to see your better resale value? In a neighborhood where every home is just so much like yours, right? Or in a neighborhood where you're surrounded by more expensive homes built by higher end builders. All right, so right now in your home buying journey, if you can't buy greatness, buy near greatness. That being said, while you're thinking about this issue of what community to buy in, there is a really interesting section in DR Horton's contract about amenities, okay? You need to hear this. It reads, to the extent that seller or the developer of the community has plans to build any amenities within the community, and those amenities are not completed at the time of closing, buyer understands that seller makes no representations or promises regarding the timing of construction or the type composition of such amenities. Goes on a little bit more about that, and then it says, buyer agrees that seller and or the developer of the community shall have no responsibility or liability for the failure to construct the planned amenities. So when you're thinking about this idea of buying near greatness, as awesome as shiny amenities are, you want to focus more on the quality of the other builders, because when it comes to amenities that aren't built yet, DR Horton is flat out saying they're not making any promises. And I think it's really interesting that they do come right out and say, hey, those amenities might not happen. I mean, at least they're being honest with you. Promised amenities are a risk, along with a whole host of risks you take when buying new construction. I talk all about those in this video, which you may want to watch next. In the meantime, Wendy out.